Well, good morning and welcome to Brewster Baptist Church this morning. My name is David Prang. I'm one of the pastors here on staff. Pastor Doug and Jill are away at American Baptist Conference down in Virginia, and they're not going to be back till Wednesday. So hang on to those emails or text messages. They won't be back till Wednesday. Answer them. This month we're in a series entitled The Art of Neighboring, where every week we're looking at one aspect, how to become a better neighbor into our community. And just as our kids were finishing up their year of school, some of you guys know this as having children, some of you may not be aware of it, but our kids took midterms and finals this past week. I thought, you know what, maybe we need to review what we've been talking about this past month, the last 3 weeks. So I thought about coming up with an exam for you, but I thought better from that. And so I thought I would just kind of review and refresh your minds for what we talked about. Well, week one, Doug spoke on the art of neighboring, and in those that may remember this, we talked about the Good Samaritan. And from the story of the Good Samaritan, we really answered, who is our neighbor? And what we learned is that our neighbor is not only in our neighborhood, but it also includes our co-workers and the people that we come across on an everyday basis. And so our neighborhood is filled with a lot of people that we come across. And Doug gave us a challenge, if you guys remember 3 weeks ago. And the challenge was he gave us a tic-tac-toe board with our house being in the middle and then basically empty spaces that we were supposed to go around and basically get to know our neighbors and write some stuff about them to help us remember who they are. And that was quite a bit of a challenge for us. I won't ask you how many of you guys actually did that at the current time. Week two, Doug spoke about who are you hanging out with? And the story was about a tax collector named Levi. And Levi was a tax collector, and back in the day, tax collectors were not very popular people, just as they're not very popular today as well. But Jesus spent time with Levi, and Levi became a follower of Christ. And one of the things that Levi wanted to do was he wanted to invite his friends, fellow tax collectors, to meet with Jesus. And so he had what we call a Levi party. And what Doug challenged us to do was to get outside of our comfort zone, get to know our neighbors, and maybe even have a Levi party where we have people from our neighborhood along with our church friends and have them get to share bread together. And lo and behold, that was the challenge, and Doug said that to you, and a number of you have come forward and shared with us, you know what, we are having a Levi party. I had a person that came up to me and said, you know what, we're having two of our friends coming over to our dinner for dinner. Will you please pray for us? And I had another person that came up and shared with us is that they're a mom and they're at a bus stop about, I don't know how many parents, but they said, you know what, we're going to have a Levi party with the parents of the kids at our bus stop. And I just want to encourage you, you got the whole summer, but to have maybe a Levi party in the sense of getting to know your neighbors and conversing with them. And then week three, Doug spoke on getting out of the salt shaker. And Doug gave us these little salt packets. I don't know if you guys were here last week, but he gave us salt packets, and he told us as a reminder that we are supposed to be the salt of the world. We are to be the Jesus to the people in our community, and that we have a flavor to give them. And so he challenged us to keep this in our pocket this week, and just to remind us that we are the salt of the world. And then I was thinking, well, we have week one, and week two, and week three, and I was going to ask you guys, how are you guys doing with these challenges of filling up the tic-tac-toe board, or having a Levi party, or being the salt, the people in your community? And I don't want you to get a raise of hands because I think some of us are kind of struggling with this. I know that many of us are struggling with this. So this morning what I want to do is I want to show you a tic-tac-toe board of my daughter who's 8 years old, if we have it up here. So during Doug's second sermon, I'm not sure she paid attention to Doug's second sermon, but she did the tic-tac-toe board. And I was super impressed. And it lists kids, it lists adults, even listed some dogs in our neighborhood, and something about each and every one of them. So I asked if it was okay to share, and she said it was okay to share. And I said, you know what, she finished that after week two, and I said, you're ahead of 90% of the adults in this congregation. I guarantee you. She said, really? And I said, yes, I guarantee you're ahead of them. And then I thought, oh, I'd share with my tic-tac-toe board because I'm not nearly as good as she is. So I have some open spaces, as you can see. So I know a few of my neighbors, but what this process has taught me is that I need to spend more time in my neighborhood, getting to know people and sharing life with them. So I want to just encourage you, if you haven't picked up one of these tic-tac-toe boards, they are at the informational desk. We got lots of them. But I want to encourage you, spend some time and try to get to know who your neighbors are. Doug challenged us, just an hour a week and walk around your neighborhood. And as I was preparing this message and then meeting with people this week, maybe a deeper question came to my mind this week. And simply is, how many of you guys are struggling with this series called The Art of Neighboring? How many of you guys are struggling with this series? And I think, talking with many of you guys are all struggling with this being the art of neighboring. And I'm thinking about why are we struggling, and what I heard was, one, it forces us to get out of our comfort zone. It makes us leave our house. It makes us leave what we feel good about, and it's like walk around and actually meet with people. And you know what? People have messy lives. They know we have messy lives, and it's just uncomfortable. And I also heard people say they involve people, like I said, that are just messy. And it's hard to do. It's outside of our comfort zone. So I thought I would put a list of what are the reasons why we're not doing this art of neighboring. And maybe some of you guys can relate to this, because I heard this among our congregation. The first one is, I don't see much value in meeting my neighbors. If we're truly honest, I've heard this from a number of you in this congregation. Making friendships with my neighbors is messy. I even heard a slogan that said, good fences make the best neighbors. Man, I thought about that and well, thank goodness Jesus have met us. And he didn't take that same approach. And we were supposed to be disciples of Christ. The second thing I heard for excuses is really the lack of time. My life is so busy, I don't have time on my schedule to get to know my neighbors, to even walk around the block. My schedule is so filled up. The third excuse that I heard was fear. And when dealing with fear is, they said, you know what, I don't even know what to say to my neighbor. What happens if they ask me questions that I don't even know about? And just the thought process of meeting a neighbor is kind of scary. And so fear sometimes grips us. And the fourth excuse that I heard this past couple weeks is really, you know what, I live mostly next to people that are only here for the summer. And they're only going to be here for 2 or 3 or 4 months. And really, am I going to make a difference if I'm going to get to know my neighbors? And I want to say, you can make a difference. Just the one time that you start talking to them, or if you build a relationship with them. See, what we have to remind ourselves is sometimes it's all about us and our own self-conceptions in the sense of our attitude needs to change. And to look at our neighbors as friends and people we want to get to know. You know, we're having this series, this isn't really about Pastor Doug having you guys get to know your neighbors. It's not David praying and trying to challenge you to get to your neighbors. What we have to remind ourselves is Jesus gave us a command. And what was the command he gave us? To love our neighbors. So how are we to love our neighbors if we don't spend time with them? If we don't value them? If we don't think that they're important? And I was thinking about the stages of friendship this week. And I think we enter into 3 stages of friendships. The first one of those is we're a stranger. They're a stranger to us, and we're a stranger to them. And the first thing that we could do is just to pray. Simply pray for opportunities for us to get to know our neighbor. And I would actually take that tic-tac-toe board, and so when you do get to know your neighbor, just write down their name and something about them. Because if you're anything like me, I typically forget people's names right away. But if I write it down and if I see it, it helps me remember it. And we move to the second stage, which I would say is acquaintances. So once you get to meet them, you say hi to them, you wave your hand when you see them. Or you even have a Levite party where you have them over to your house, which is dealing with number 3 stage is relationships. You share a meal or a dessert, you hang out, you have fun. You may even, encourage them to come over and you have a fire in your fire pit. Or invite them over for cards. But we have to work on the stages going from stranger to acquaintance to friendship. And you're not going to do it with every single neighbor. But it's going to be amazing, I think, to see how God will work relationships into your life with your neighbors. So this week, what are we talking about this week? Simply, what type of neighbor are you? What is your temperament? What's your personality? And we're going to look at a famous story that many of you guys have heard before, but I want you to look at it with fresh eyes. I want you to look at it as if you never heard this story before, but in the context of neighboring. What does it mean to be a neighbor? And this story's come from Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. So if you have a Bible, just turn to Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. If you don't, it'll be on the screen behind me, and let me read it to you. It says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. Martha was distracted by all the preparation that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister had left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. So in this simple story, we have three characters. We have a Martha, a Mary, and a Jesus. And each one of them bring a different temperament, a different personality to friendship and to neighboring. And we're going to look at each one of those. And the first one we're going to look at is simply Martha. And I want to read to you again verse 38 to you as we look at Martha and who Martha makes up. It says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparation that had to be made. So what do we learn about Martha is simply that she's a hostess. She's making sure that her house is in ready condition. She probably spent time cleaning it, making sure everything wasn't dirty, preparing the food. As we know, she was preparing the food. She was probably making the disciples and Jesus feel comfortable by offering them drinks. But she's back there in the kitchen. And when I think of Martha, I think of her as like a doer. She does things to make people feel loved, to make people feel cared for. And it's just a hunch, when I was reading through this and learning more about Martha, it's just a hunch, I think Martha was a better cook than Mary. And the reason I say this is actually Jesus 3 times in the Gospels commends Martha for her cooking and her preparation and showing love in that way. Just a side note. Do we have any Marthas in this congregation? I think that we do. I'm actually more comfortable being a doer than anything else. See, every one of us, we know of doers, people that do things, and when they do things, they show their love by the way they do things. But what does that look like in our everyday life? How does that help us be the neighbor that God has called us to be? And as I mentioned earlier, it could be just simply when you have someone over at your house, you're cleaning the house, you're preparing and cooking the meal, you're meeting the needs of the people that come to your house. But I was also thinking, well, what else could it be? And I was thinking of a woman in our church, and she takes care of children. People in her neighborhood knows that when she gets a phone call, she'll take that phone call, and the message will be, is there any way I can drop off my child at your house? Would you watch her? And she will always gladly say yes. It doesn't matter if it's a doctor's appointment, have to go to the grocery store down in Hyannis, or if it's work. She is just a true blessing to the people in her neighborhood, but also to our church family. And why does she do it? She does it because she loves not only kids, but she loves her neighbors. And she's willing to do that. And I was thinking of other ways in which we can show love. And I know when I was, when we had our first child, whether it was child number 1 through child number 5, I appreciated whenever we got a meal that first 2 weeks, when we got back from the hospital. That simple thing of bringing over a meal, and we had people from our neighborhood that brought over meals to us, and we just appreciated that. That was a sense of love that they cared for us, because they knew that first couple of weeks, that first month, it is tough when you have a child. Other times that you can bring over a meal is when you know that someone is sick or they're in a hospital stay or in death. I want to encourage you, one of the best ways that you can show love is by bringing over a meal or giving that family a gift certificate to go out to eat. And in their times of grief and their times of trouble, they will remember the people that took the time to make a meal or drop off a gift certificate. Another person that I thought was my parents. My parents are the classic Marthas. They love doing things for other people. They don't like receiving things like that, but they love doing things for people. And they live in they have a house, and right next to their house is a duplex. And they have neighbors that come and go for the most part because most of the people that rent from this duplex are single mom with just a couple kids or young families. And so my parents would just go over and try to, greet them, make relationships and friendships with them. And long before home, my parents will often say, is there anything that I can do for you? Is there anything that's broken that needs to be fixed? And my dad will go over and fix it. Or they'll say, is there anything that you need me to build? Because he's a builder, and he'll build something for them. And my parents will often say, hey, if you need me to watch your kids, I'll be willing to do that. Just have them come on over. And they can play on our driveway. They can ride their bikes on our driveway because our driveway is flat. Or if their kids want to play basketball, we have a basketball hoop. Whatever you want, we can do for you. And I think about it, that's neighborly love, isn't it? I mean, if you have a friendship or if you have a relationship with a neighbor like that, you just feel good about that neighbor. And that's what Christ is asking us to do, is to be more like Martha. So when we think of Martha, we think of her as a doer, of caring for people, but it's by the things that she does to help them, to love them. Which leads us up to our second character, right? Or we have Martha and we have Mary. And Mary has a totally different temperament than Martha. And I want to read to you verse 39 where we learn about Mary's temperament. It says, she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what Jesus said. So what is Mary's neighborhood style? She's simply a listener. She simply cared about the relationship between her and Jesus, between her and the disciples. What's our image that we see that she does? She's sitting at Jesus' feet. She's giving him the attention that he so richly deserves. And when you spend time with someone, you elevate them. You make them feel important. You make them feel cared for when you give them your full attention. And that's what Mary was doing at this case. And it wasn't the first time that Mary's done that. And when you read through the Gospels, just as I was reading through for Martha, Mary is mentioned 3 times, sitting at the Lord's feet, listening to him, having conversations with him. In Luke 10, John 11, John 12, Mary takes on this role as a listener. She's showing compassion. She's showing care towards the people that she's with. Do we have any Marys here in this congregation? We do have some Marys in this congregation. No doubt about that. People who have the gift of compassion, that are good listeners, that deeply care about people, which made me think, well, what does that look like in our everyday life? And when I was thinking about this, I was reminded of my own wife, Christy. See, we have a dog. And a dog requires what? Work. Requires us to walk them around the neighborhood. And I will tell you that my kids and myself, we don't care to walk the dog all that much. But my wife loves it. I don't know if it's a weaning away from the kids and the husband, or she really enjoys it. I don't know. But I'll take it that she enjoys walking the dog. And she walks the dog, and she will come and she'll meet our neighbors. And they'll say hi to each other, and they'll make some small talk and so forth. But one of the days that she was out walking the dog, probably about a month and a half ago, she ran into a neighbor, and that neighbor basically said, hey, you know what? I just have to share what's going on in my life with you. My wife is just walking the dog, and she stops. And the neighbor basically says, you know what? My boyfriend/husband is leaving me. And then he may be taking the dogs. I don't know what's going to happen. And, just making conversation. And what was my wife to do? She just listened. She tried to show compassion and to care. And that woman kept on talking and talking about her life. Now, it could have been very easily, she had said, you know what, I have other things to do, thanks for sharing that, and just kept on walking. Well, she didn't do that. She made the time for that woman. She was being that neighborly friend. A couple weeks later, she actually met with that woman again, and that woman shared about how her dog passed away. You know, that's a traumatic instance. Now, once again, my wife could have made that decision. What's the neighborly thing to do is to, talk with her. Just to listen, to show compassion. There's so many times that we can meet our neighbor's needs just by listening and caring. I thought about myself a few years ago. We have bus stop duty. We have kids that are in elementary school, and so you have to have someone there to get the kid on the bus, and my job is to get the kid off the bus. And so I get there, my first couple of years living where I live, and what struck me was simply everybody stayed in their vehicle waiting for their child to get off the bus. And so I decided, well, I'm just going to get out of my vehicle and stand by the stop sign and see if anybody joined me. Nobody joined me. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. So I started trying to talk to people, and I would get there early, and they would roll down their window, and we would start having conversations. And slowly throughout the year, people started getting out of their vehicle, and we would just start talking at the bus stop. And what is amazing, it's not that many families, but what is amazing to me is that when it was just me and somebody else, like that one-on-one, they would start sharing about their life. They would start sharing about their struggles with their kids. And they're like, how do you do it? You have 5 kids. And for the most part, I just listen. And I just asked them how they were doing, or I was just trying to encourage them, because I don't have it all together. We're just doing the best that we possibly can with our kids. But each of these neighbors, they have struggles. And they actually, if you're just open to listening, they will share their struggles with you. And that's what I've learned, is that sometimes in life, we have to be more like Mary. And for me, that's difficult. I'm more of a worker and just want to do her. But sometimes in life, we just have to be a listener and to show compassion and care. So what type of neighbor was Mary? One that was a listener and a caring person. She's simply giving people the opportunity to talk and to be heard. So let me ask you the question this morning. What type of neighbor are you? Are you giving your neighbors the opportunity to talk and to be heard? Or are you rushing right by with your own merry way? Which leads us up to the third character. The third character is simply Jesus. And as you can remember from the story, you have Martha, who's preparing this great meal, a feast probably for Jesus and his disciples. And her attitude was getting worked up because she was doing it all by herself, and she was stressed, and she was hoping her sister would come in and help. And we pick up the story in verse 40. It says, "But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had been made. She came to him and asked, 'Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me.' 'Martha, Martha,' the Lord answered, 'you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, indeed only one. And Mary had chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her.'" See, when you look at Jesus' life, you see that Jesus is bombarded with questions. He's questions by the religious people, by his own disciples, and by just ordinary people that he comes across. In this case, Martha. And we see that Jesus cares deeply for Martha, because Martha is exhibiting her neighborly, loving way of making the house look beautiful by giving them drinks, by preparing the meal. But Jesus also loves Mary. And Mary is what? Sitting at Jesus' feet, having conversation and dialogue, discussing things. And then you have, so both of them are exhibiting good neighboring skills, but Jesus is faced with a question by Martha. And how does Jesus answer that question? And how does Jesus answer most questions? Whether it's the religious people, his disciples, he does it in one particular way. I would say is that he answered the question with love, with grace, and with truth. See, he loved Mary. Even though loved Martha, even though Martha had a problem with her attitude, he loved her. He showed her grace by how he answers. And he answers by truth. And he simply recognizes and responds and says, you know what, Martha? You're the one that has the problem. It's your attitude that has the problem. And of course, this probably hurt Martha. But he spoke in a sense of love towards her and grace. And when you have someone speak to you in love and grace, even if you hear the truth, it may still hurt, it may still sting, but you know it's coming from someone who really truly cares what's best for you. In being a good neighbor, sometimes we have to model what Jesus has for us. We have to talk in a sense of love, grace, and truth. We have to love people where they're at. We have to offer them grace. And we have to offer them truth. There are many times that we have to answer questions, whether it's from our neighbors or from our friends about our Christian faith. And we need to do this in love and grace and truth. And I was thinking about an example of this in my own life. And about 10 years ago, I know that doesn't look like it now, but I was a very healthy individual. I was exercising quite a bit. In fact, I was part of a group that often did marathons, bike races of 50 to 100 miles, or we would do swims from 1 to 2 miles every week. And was a part of this group called triathletes. And it was made up of a group of 10 to 20 athletes. And most of these guys, men and women, they didn't go to church at all. They competed every Sunday or every other Sunday in these races. And so I would get together with them, and we would run together, we would bike together, we would swim together, and we would share stories because it would just help us pass the time. We would talk about what's going on in our life. And what was interesting about this group is that it really wasn't that interesting, but they would cuss quite often. And they would share about wild stories and so forth. It led to many interesting conversations, and we talked about a lot of things. Until one day, about 4 weeks into me being part of this group, is one of the guys, and there was about 8 guys in the group, or 8 people in the group made up of men and women, and said, "Oh, hey, David, I heard that you're a pastor in the local church." And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, how do I respond to this? Of course, I'm going to say yes. And then his next question, he goes, "Why are you a pastor? Why would you want to be a pastor?" And I'm thinking to myself, well, how do I respond to this? Because I got 7 or 8 people listening to every word I said. And so I start to pray in my own mind. I'm like, God, you're going to help me with this. And I'm nervous as nervous can be because I care about these people. And in the way I answer, I don't know if they're going to like me afterwards. And I start sharing about my Christian faith, about how God, I felt, has helped me through times where I struggled. And that it led me into ministry and how I moved my family from Wisconsin to Massachusetts. And I just feel like, you know what? There's no better thing than to be a pastor. And they heard what I had to say, and they just went on with their conversation. I worried probably the next day and a half. I wonder how they're going to respond to me the next time I get together with them. But it was interesting, the next time I got together with them, and from that time on, they referred to me as the pastor of the group, or Pastor David. And all the cussing that used to happen got dwindled all of a sudden. The wild stories became a little bit less. And I continued this relationship for the next 4 or 5 years with this group of 10 to 20 men and women. And what was interesting to me is that they started feeling open about asking about spiritual conversations like, what is Christianity all about? Who is Jesus? And why is he important? Doesn't all religions lead to the same place? They asked me things like, why do good things, or why do bad things happen to good people? They asked me, do you really believe in hell? Doesn't everybody go to heaven? Or what is heaven really like? And so it gave me a platform to share about spiritual things. But I did it in a sense of always love, grace, and truth. And sometimes those topics they ask you about, at least for me, I cringe because I know that sometimes what I'm going to say might be offensive. It might be something that goes across the culture. But you do it anyway because for these people, I may be the only Jesus that they know. They're not going to come to church. I invite them to church. They're not at that point yet. And that's how I think of Jesus and how we need to be to our neighbors, how we need to be the people around us. We need to offer love, grace, and truth. And sometimes they will disagree with what you have to say, but you know what? They still love you. They will still care about you. And that's what Jesus has us do. To close our time together, we got to think about these three characters. And simply, how are we to be a good neighbor to the people around us? For some of us, we're more like Martha. We're a doer, and we do things because we love people. And there's times in our life, for all of us, that we're a Martha. But there's also times in our life where we are simply a Mary. There's times people in our relationship, in our friendships, that they just need a listening ear. They need love and compassion and care. And there's times where we need to be that as a neighbor. And there are some times in our life that we have to be a Jesus. We have to show love. We have to show grace. But we also need to share the truth. All of these things are valuable in the way we neighbor. And we need to practice these things in our everyday life. So let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I give you thanks, Lord, for this passage and to remind us, Lord, the importance of being a neighbor, to care for people, to love them, to where they're at. Lord, we pray, Lord, for each of us, Lord, that we will get to know our neighbors by filling out a tic-tac-toe board, Lord, to remember their names and something about them. Help us to spend an hour of our time every week just outside of our doors and into our neighborhood and building relationships, Lord. For some of us, Lord, that have been thinking about having a Levi party, Lord, help us to take the challenge to actually invite people to our house. And Lord, help us to remember the salt packet, that we have flavor, Lord, that we can share with other people. We pray all this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.